This is Chewing the Gristle, a poetry chat with my friend and co-host, the poet, Tim Conroy. Welcome, Tim.
My brother, the poet Al Black.
And today our poet is Francisco Aragón. Welcome, Francisco.
Thank you, Al. Thank you, Tim. I'm glad to be here.
Francisco Aragón is the son of Nicaraguan immigrants, a native of San Francisco, California. He holds degrees in Spanish from UC Berkeley and NYU. Upon his return to the U.S. in 1998, after a decade in Spain, Aragón completed graduate degrees in creative writing from UC Davis and the University of Notre Dame. In 2003, he joined the faculty of the University of Notre Dame's Institute for Latino Studies, ILS, where he established Letras Latinas, the ILS National Literary Initiative. In 2007, Letras Latinas established an office in Washington, D.C., initiating a stable presence there, carrying out literary programming with the Library of Congress, the Folger Library, and various branches of the Smithsonian, among others. In 2017, Aragón was named a finalist for Split This Rock's Freedom Plow Award for Poetry and Activism. He is the author of 2 books of poetry, Puerta del Sol, Bilingual Press, and Glow of Our Sweat, Scapegoat Press, as well as the editor of the Winds Shift New Latino Poetry, University of Arizona Press. After Rubén, his next and first full-length book was published by Red Hen Press in 2020. Early influences that got you into poetry.
Thank you for the question, Al. I became interested in poetry when I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. I was very fortunate to be on the campus in the mid-'80s when such poets as Thom Gunn, Robert Pinsky, Ishmael Reed, Gary Soto were on the faculty there. And my very first poetry workshop when I was a sophomore was with the writer Ishmael Reed. The other very important experience I had during those years was joining the staff of the student-run Berkeley Poetry Review. So those 2 experiences of taking workshops as a student and helping run a small literary journal were very instrumental. And one of the things I enjoyed about being in Ishmael Reed's class was that he was very good about introducing his students to a wide variety of voices. For example, it was in his class that I first got to read the work of and meet the Puerto Rican poet Victor Hernández Cruz, who at the time, his day job was as a mailman in Oakland. And little did I know that I was meeting, in my view, one of our most important living American poets. So just that environment of being in Berkeley in the mid-'80s was very enriching and instrumental because I got exposed to such a wide swath of voices.
That's wonderful. Tim.
Let's kind of jump in immediately and talk about your new book, After Rubén, because it is a pedagogical book, right? In a lot of ways, it's so instructive. Can you talk a bit about the cohesion around the book, the vision of the book?
Well, the title of the book, After Rubén, is an allusion to the Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío, who many scholars will say was instrumental in renovating Spanish poetry, Spanish language poetry. But for me, it was more personal. Being the son of Nicaraguan immigrants, Rubén Darío's poetry is something I associate with my childhood. One of the things about this book, in terms of how I organized it, is that I decided to include an essay at the end of the book titled My Rubén, which I divided into 3 sections. And section 1 is about my mother mostly. Well, it's about my mother's Rubén Darío. Section 2 is about my father's Rubén Darío. And section 3 is about another of the story that I want to tell in this book, is how more recently certain scholars have discovered that Rubén Darío was involved in a relationship with the Mexican poet Amado Nervo. I would say that of my 3 books, this is my Nicaraguan book, and that I really do, especially in section 1, talk about poems that that use as a source of inspiration my Nicaraguan roots. It's also a book that came together as I organized it in the era of our current and thankfully outgoing president. And some have said that this is my most political of my 3 books. And so it's a book that tries to pay homage to my literary forefathers and foremothers. It's a book that tries to talk about my Nicaraguan identity. And it's also a book that doesn't shy away from talking about my queer identity either.
No, I think it's a unbelievably beautiful and courageous book in many ways, and it really pierces. The poems in there pierce. Talk a little bit about you as a translator in this book, and you as sort of an ekphrastic writer of poems in this book, and how that sort of comes together in this reinterpretation of poems.
So one of the threads of the book are that I include what I'll call 10 versions in English of Spanish language poems by Rubén Darío. And when I was in graduate school at Notre Dame about 20 years ago, I had the experience of taking a poetry workshop whose organizing principle was translation. And what I took away from that class was that translation is also an act of creativity. And it was in that class that I learned and gave myself permission to use the original source poem as a springboard to writing a poem in English. So whenever I talk about the translations in this particular book, I always put translation in quotation marks, because in many regards, I'm taking a lot of liberties. That said, when I first got started writing seriously in the mid-'80s, I did do a fair amount of what I would call more traditional and conventional translation. But with Rubén Darío, it's more personal. And for all the reasons I've stated so far, I felt like I gave myself permission to break some of the rules of translation, to riff off of Rubén Darío, to rewrite Rubén Darío, to reinterpret Rubén Darío.
I think this is a great time to hear a couple of the poems from the book.
Sure. And since I'll share with you 2 of the versions of Rubén Darío. So the first one I'll read is probably closer to a more traditional translation. The original poem in Spanish was called Allá lejos, and I translate the poem as far away. Ox I saw as a child, breath, little clouds of steam, vivid in the sun. Nicaragua, a fertile ranch, abundant. Rhythms tropic, dove in a forest of sound. Wind, bird, bull, axe. The core of me are these, and these I praise. Yes, ox, lumbering, you evoke tender dawn, the milking hour, when days were white and rose. And you, cooing mountain dove, recall April, May, when spring was all, was everything. And then I'll share with you, so that one, those of you who get the book, you'll notice that right beneath the title, I put Rubén Darío in parentheses. And that was my way of saying that this is a poem that's approaching a more traditional translation. But the one I want to share with you now is one where I take more liberties. Rubén Darío wrote a sonnet titled simply Walt Whitman, and I decided to use Rubén Darío's version of Walt Whitman to write a version of that poem, and I title my piece simply Walt. And I call this Walt after Rubén Darío's Walt Whitman. His country of iron where he lives, an older man, fatherly, strong, wholesome, calm, his appearance impressive, the furrow of his brow persuades and charms, no end to his soul that mimics a mirror, the tired curve of his shoulders draped with a cloak, and with his harp carved from oak, he sings his song like a prophet. He's a priest fueling a wind that promises and promises. Fly, he says to an eagle, to a seaman, row, while a chiseled, robust worker hears, put your shoulder to the wheel. This is the path our poet takes, magnificent face.
Hey, Francisco, you read beautifully.
Thank you.
Just amazing. As a backdrop for more discussion, let's talk about your passion for literary activism and what your purpose for that activism is.
Yeah, I think there's two facets to it. When I finished, in some ways, I didn't aspire to have the day job that I have. When I finished my degree at Notre Dame in 2003, I was lucky enough to land a job with the Institute for Latino Studies. At the time that I joined the Institute, it did not have a literary component to it. So my charge was to create one, and that's how I started Letras Latinas. And Letras Latinas is simply a consortium of initiatives around the idea of promoting and enhancing the visibility of Latino and Latina writers, particularly poetry, because that's my passion. So one of the areas that I would say I try to be an activist is simply by creating opportunities and spaces to enhance and amplify voices that have been historically marginalized. So, for example, we have something called the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize, which is a first book prize that's been around since 2004 for Latino poets. In the bio that Al read earlier, he alluded to partnerships that Letras Latinas has done with the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress. And I've managed to forge relationships with various stakeholders to create opportunities for Latino and Latinx voices to share their work in more mainstream spaces. So that's one aspect of my activism, is creating opportunities for Latino and Latina voices. The other area, which is more recent, in which I talk about in the essay in the book, is this idea of trying to push back against efforts of silencing or downplaying queer voices. And I use my project with Rubén Darío as another manifestation of that. The book talks about, in the essay, these 9 letters that were discovered by scholars that revealed for the first time that Rubén Darío in 1900 was intimate with the Mexican poet named Amado Nervo. When that came to light, there were efforts to try to downplay that or silence that. And I took it upon myself to try to amplify that story, because I believe that people's voices, whatever they say, shouldn't be silenced. So that's another area, or a way that I try to live out my activism, by making sure that it's a very inclusive table, no matter what people are writing about.
What about your own poetry style that you, because you rode on a subway, it sparked a poem? So talk about your poetry style and what you think that is?
Well, I think because I was born and raised in San Francisco, a city, because I lived in Madrid, Spain for 9 years, another city, uh, some of my work, a good portion of my work has been described as having very much an urban landscape. And so I think I am a creature of the city. So on the one hand, a lot of my work, especially in my first two books, um, the city is a subject. Public spaces is a subject. I mean, when I lived in Spain for those 9 years, it's 10 years, 1 year in Barcelona, 9 years in Spain. 8 of those years, I taught English as a foreign language. And as a result, I had to spend a lot of time on public transportation, both buses and subways. And so inevitably, I think a number of my poems go through those public spaces. In terms of my other aesthetic, I consider myself first and foremost a reader and lover of poetry before I even want to call myself a poet. So I am a lover of language. And so I delight in language. And so the other aesthetic is that the poem has to produce pleasure. It has to produce pleasure in my ear, both as a reader. And so then that's something that I try to replicate when I'm writing a poem. It may sound like a cliche, but sometimes the subject matter of the poem is secondary. I want to make sure that what I'm producing is going to bring some kind of pleasure to the reader on the level of orality. When I'm writing my poems, one of the mechanisms I use in terms of revision is simply reading the poem out loud to myself and seeing how it sounds when it's being read out loud, and that often helps me find places in the poem that need to be revised or tinkered. So, I'm an urban poet primarily, and I'm interested in producing pleasing language. But I will say also, getting back to your idea of ekphrasis, which is poems that are inspired by other works of art, I will say that in my most recent book, After Rubén, many of the poems do use other texts as springboards for the poem. So even though it originates with another text, I then try to invigorate it and make it my own in some way.
Yes. So for many poets, revision is a struggle. Talk to us about your process of revision.
There's a poem in this book, the poem 1985. In fact, I wrote an essay about this poem. The very first version of 1985 was written in like 1986. And the final revision of that poem was like 3 years ago. So depending on the poem, it could be a matter of months to a matter of years to a matter of decades. And so there is that notion that you never finish poems, you just abandon them. And I sort of agree with that. I mean, there's notations when I read from this book now. There's certain poems that I have notations where I've changed it since the book has been published. In terms of my process, I guess I take it as far as I can go, and then I have a handful of readers who I then send it to and ask them to look at it, a fresh set of eyes. The challenges of I don't presently don't belong to a writing group, so I have like 3 or 4 people who I send things to. But before I do that, I take it as far as I can go. And a poem could go through, a dozen versions before I'll show it to someone. I just took a workshop just to get my feet wet again a couple of weekends ago. And the workshop was called Family Matters, Writing Poetry from Family Photographs. And over the course of that weekend, I produced one poem. But since the workshop concluded, it's already gone through like 5 revisions. And that's been like just in the last, 10 days. So certainly revision is very, very key and important. The other thing I'll say is that sometimes we need distance. Sometimes I might just need to put a poem in a drawer for several months and return to it with new eyes. And that's helpful because, that yields areas in the poem that perhaps we don't see or we're not cognizant of when when the poem is still very fresh. We need a lot of time and distance before we can go back and revise some more even.
Who is fueling Francisco's poetry imagination right now? Who are you reading?
Well, a project that I'm working on right now, after Rubén, is a translation project. When I lived in Spain, I became very interested and enamored of the experimental and avant-garde poetry that was being written in Europe in the early 20th century. And there's a Spanish poet named Gerardo Diego who was part of a school of poetry called Creationism. And there's a book of his which I translate as Handbook of Foams, which is sort of this experimental poetry. And I'm actually been working a lot with his work right now because my hope is to eventually publish a dual language book of his poems, my translations, and his Spanish originals. He was a wonderful poet. He was a pianist, an art critic. His day job was as a French teacher at an all-girls Catholic school in Madrid. And he was just one of the first poets of Lorca's generation who became interested in the avant-garde. And so Gerardo Diego is who I'm immersed in right now, his poetry.
Share with us a couple more of your poems.
Sure. I will read, since I alluded to it, I'll read that poem, 1985. The poem is set in San Francisco. And the backdrop of this poem, basically, I mean, when you think about the 1980s, 1985, those were the Reagan years. And this is a poem that is, in some ways, critiquing Reagan's policy in Central America, specifically Nicaragua. So it's called 1985. Long and black, the streaks of gray, a flutter in the light wind as she prepares to tell her story at the Federal Building. Reaching into a tattered sack, she pulls out a doll, missing an eye, balding, singed face smudged with soot from the smoke her home took in as her village was being shelled. Next, she retrieves what's left of a book, a few pages, the borders brown, coming apart in her hands. Hesitant, she raises one, starts to read aloud. Por la mañana sube el sol y calienta el día. La tierra nos da donde vivir y qué comer. La vaca nos da leche para beber y hacer mantequilla. It's her daughter's lesson, the poem she read to her the day they struck. In the morning the sun rises and warms the day. The earth provides a place to live and what to eat. The cow gives us milk to drink and churn butter with. Midway through, her voice begins to shake. Her words, like refugees exposed to the night, shiver, freeze. Silence swallows us all. Her words, drifting casualties, gather and huddle in my throat. And I'll read a second piece. While we're in San Francisco, I'll read a second piece, which is also set in San Francisco. And this piece is simply called Bay Area Rapid Transit, which the acronym for Bay Area Rapid Transit is BART. BART is the subway system. It's a system that's underground in San Francisco, but above ground elsewhere. Bay Area Rapid Transit. Her hair, cropped short as a punk's, same gray as these connected cars. Her pullover's blue, snug, the few holes along her sleeves, flesh-colored sores. She's cursing the crooks at City Hall. Then go back to where you are from, he says, off in a huff at Powell. On her feet now, she spots another, facing the light-streaked black, crosses the aisle, sits beside him. The puffy skin beneath her eyes, pinkish. I hate this place, she says, holding an envelope. Could you help me with this address? They cut me off. Those boys, what they did to that girl outside my room on the stairs. And the joints of her fingers, bulbs. I was, a typist in New York. Oh, she says, what'll I do? Do you know this address? What should I tell them? I swear sometimes if maybe I just... Her voice dissolving, mingling with the long, sharp whistle, the sound of the rails as the convoy begins to break, and then the sliding doors and steps off the train.
Now, after hearing that poem, talk about how you go about thinking about line breaks, the openings of poems, the endings of poems. Tell us about your thought process.
Sure. Oftentimes, a poem will start with simply a fragment of language. I might be going about my day, and suddenly a fragment of language might come to mind because of something I'm experiencing. And when I finally get around to it, I'll just start to take that fragment of language and start writing, just free writing. I don't even begin to think about things like line breaks or stanzas till later. Right now, it's just a matter of getting all that raw material onto the page. And so just free writing. But often it will start with a fragment of language, which I'll find pleasing. Another thing that I've often found is that fragment of language might be inspired by a sensory experience. I might be walking down the street, and a smell will suddenly overcome me, and it'll trigger a childhood memory that I haven't thought about in 10 years. And so it might be a combination of a sensory perception and a fragment of language is the trigger, and then just trying to get it all out. And then once I get to that point, then I'll begin to experiment with stanzas. I might try to lineate it and write it in lines. And then the first version of that might just be one block of, one long stanza. And then I'll begin to experiment with, well, what happens if I write 3-line stanzas, 4-line stanzas, 2-line stanzas? At that point, I might type up 3 versions of the same poem and tape it up on my wall where it'll sit for weeks. And I'll just decide which one is yielding the more interesting line breaks and stanza breaks. And that will just, okay, this poem is going to be in tercets, 3-line stanzas. Oh no, this poem looks like it's asking to be in couplets, 2-line stanzas. And so that's sort of how it starts. But it all oftentimes starts with a fragment of language and some sort of sensory perception. At least what I'm describing is my earlier work, perhaps even of the first 2 books. But I think that's one place to start. It's just a fragment of language that I find pleasing to the ear.
It's sort of reflection is always interesting to do, especially in your previous collections. And now that you have 3 collections that are out, what do you think in your poetry journey? Is there themes that surprised you that you wrote about that came out? Is there anything that sort of emerges throughout your collections, whether it's an expression of bewilderment or empathy or connection?
I would say that, you know, one of the early obsessions of mine was, and this is related to sort of piggybacking on what I've just said, but one of the early obsessions was to try to chronicle or depict in language how memory functions. And some of the work that I wrote early on is I'm trying to reproduce for the reader what that experience is like. There's a poem in my first book called Light Yogurt Strawberry Milk, in which I'm describing the speaker is waking up in the middle of the night. There's a lightning storm out there. He goes to the refrigerator. He opens the refrigerator. He takes out a yogurt. He peels off the top of the yogurt. He begins to take a sip of that little liquid that's at the top of the yogurt, and it's a strawberry flavored yogurt. And as soon as he gets a whiff of that strawberry, he's hurtled back to when he was like 3 years old and his mother was bringing him a glass of milk first thing in the morning. And it's just a jolting experience. And so in that particular poem, I'm trying to take the reader on that journey and trying to reproduce with words on the page what that person experienced with that whiff of strawberry and how he gets hurtled back instantaneously to when he was 3 years old. So memory, trying to depict memory was an early obsession of mine. More recently, with After Rubén, I'm going to sound like a broken record, it's the idea of getting another work of art, like a text, and seeing how I can use that as my clay to refashion into another work of art, or a work of visual art. Sometimes I might be contemplating a work of visual art which will trigger a memory. There's memory again. Or I might be looking at a work of visual art and the scene reminds me of something that's happening currently in my life, and the work of visual art again will serve as a springboard. So more recently, I seem to be more interested in other works of art as triggers to new works of art. But sometimes the subject matter might end up being the same. It might still end up being a childhood memory. It just so happens that the trigger is a different one. You know, the trigger might be a visual work of art, or the trigger might be, you know, a taste of yogurt. In terms of themes, you know, the After Rubén is sort of my Nicaragua book. Puerta del Sol is my Spain book. This is the book that I wrote when all the poems in this book were all originating when I lived in Spain. My middle book, Glow of Our Sweat. This one I had an agenda. This book is also punctuated with an essay. This one I might say was my first intentional queer book, in which I gathered unpublished poems that hadn't appeared in any books, but somehow were engaging with queer poetics. So each book is different, but sometimes some obsessions do crisscross all the books.
Brother Al.
Oftentimes, poets and people that teach poetry, which you do, have resources or books that either they refer to or they recommend to poets. What are your resources and books that you work with as a writer?
Well, I'm happy to give a plug of a book that I've been using now for many years as a teacher, and it has a Bay Area connection because it's a book called A Poet's Companion, and I think it has a subtitle, Appreciating, Reading, and Writing Poetry, and it's co-authored by a poet named Kim Adonisio, who has Bay Area connections, and her co-author is Dorianne Locks, who teaches now at North Carolina State University, but prior to that, she taught at the University of Oregon. And it's a wonderful book in that it offers it's broken up into various subjects like metaphor, simile, memory, and it offers sample poems and it offers writing exercises. And I've been using that book. First of all, when the book first came out, which was quite some time ago, I used it myself as an aspiring poet. But I got so much out of it that whenever I teach my poetry writing workshop, which I do in the spring, I dip into that book to do exercises. Another resource that I use, which I learned when I was a grad student at UC Davis, and I learned it from my teacher there, Sandra McPherson, is identifying a poem that you like and using the structure of that poem, let's call it the scaffolding of that poem, and emptying out that poem of all of its content words and using just the vessel, the grammar of the poem, and inserting your own content words. And that oftentimes can yield the first draft of a poem. So you sort of identify a poem that you'd like, and simply take out its verbs and its nouns and just leave in the grammar words, and then put in your own verbs and nouns and see what you come up with. And that's an exercise that I use with my students. And I've also done it myself with good results.
That's a wonderful tip for folks. There's so many things I still want to ask you, but as our time is sort of running down, so I do want to let listeners know the best way to get hold of your books.
Sure. There's a wonderful initiative called bookshop.org. It's a wonderful initiative that is trying to support independent bookstores. And my latest book, which is the one that I'm plugging a lot now, is available there, bookshop.org. And the first two books, Amazon has the first two books, but and I think bookshop.org has this book as well. But certainly, bookshop.org is a great resource. Bookshop.org.
Let our listeners know about your website again.
Sure. Yeah, my website is easy. It's franciscoaragon.net, just my first and last name, all pushed together, .net. And there's sample poems there, sample interviews, all kinds of stuff.
It's a robust website, and Al and I cannot recommend this book enough. Francisco, how about reading two more poems for us?
Sure. I will read. The book is dedicated to my father, so I will read the first and last poem of section 3. So, the first poem of section 3 is titled Portrait with Lines of Montali. And Montali is a reference to the Italian poet Eugenio Montali. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 50s. And the method of this poem is I'm taking translated lines of Eugenio Montali's poems, translated into English, and I'm cobbling them together to create a portrait. And it's dedicated to my father. Portrait with Lines of Montali. A patch of town-sick country. The old shop window, shuttered and harmless. An odor of bruised melons oozes from the floor, among wicker furniture and a mattress. Mildew, like grass, sprouts as well. The delicate capillaries of slime. Signs of quite another orbit. The ungraspable gorge. Sentiments and sediment where my carved name quivers. His laugh is jagged, coughing. And I'll close with a very brief poem called Hotel Mirror. Looking, I thought, hair? And a voice said, on your head? Where? Who is that staring back with such a round face? That paunch? Father or son? Thank you.
Delightful. And the last line is everything in that poem. Wow. This has been a delightful interview, and I wish we could go longer, but I can't end this interview without telling folks, please, if you're looking for something to read, take a journey with the poet Francisco Aragón and buy the book After Rubén. I came away thinking, I know him better. You know, if I was living back in Indiana, I'm sure when COVID's over, I'd say, hey, we got to go for coffee. I want to thank our poet, Francisco Aragón, the author of the new book, After Rubén. Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you, Al, and thank you, Tim. It's been an immense pleasure spending this time with both of you.